Signal Kahungunu. It's my great pleasure to host this online masterclass for you today. We've got lots of attendees and people are just joining us as we speak, but I want to get us off to a very quick start because we've got some fantastic speakers and marvellous material to deal with over the next hour. So welcome everybody to Otago Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago, and to us virtually here in Wellington and Christchurch and Dunedin, our three campuses.
Ko te mihi nei ki tēnei whare, tēnā koe. Ko te mihi nei ki ngā mana whenua kei konei, Waitaha ka te mai moi kai tahu tēnā koutou. Ko te mihi nei ki te kai karakia, tēnā koe a Louise. Ko te mihi nei kia koutou, kei konei i te hui topa, kia ora koutou katoa. Ko ai au, i te taho o tōku pāpā, ko tainui te waka e whakatateri ana e oku tupuna, ko Ngāti Mōtai, ko Ngāti Tūkorihi, ko Ngāti Takaha, rātou ko Ngāti Tamaterā, oku hapu, ko pai o hauraki, ko ringa rātou, ko ruapeka oku marae. I te taho o tōku mama, no Afrika ki te tonga, me koti rāna ahau, ko Thorsgaard te waka o tōku mama. I te pūaki ahau kei taupō, e noho ana ahau kei otipoti. Ko Robin Quigg tōku ingoa, he pukenga mātua haora Māori ki Otago Whakaihu Waka, i te tari hauora tūmata nui kei otipoti, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Really privileged to be here today, and thank you all. So I've just said that I'm from the Tainui Waka, which isn't the waka in the picture there, by the way, but Tainui Waka from the areas of Waikato and Hauraki in the North Island, and on my father's, it's on my father's side, and from my mother's side, I'm from South Africa and Scotland, and she arrived on the Thorsgaard, and that is a picture of the Thorsgaard. So, and I'm a senior lecturer in Māori Health in the Dunedin Department of Public Health at the University of Otago. And so I'm presenting an aspect of some of the research I've been involved in today, and in the words of one of our participants, if you like a lolly, you'll like a vape. And so that sort of set me on the thoughts in particular to share with you today. What were those voices, and that's part of my role to share those voices with you, and part of the integrity I have as a researcher and teacher to make sure their voices are heard after they've shared them with us. So it was a qualitative study, kaupapa Māori qualitative study, so by Māori for Māori, and that idea, that method, that way, and our aim was to understand the context and characteristics of stealth vaping, which I'll talk a little bit more about the whys. So I guess stealth vaping is discreet and undetected, but for Māori, tobacco and nicotine products have been used used on us and with us as commercial features, and so we have a long-running history of tobacco in our communities, and we bear the greater burden of harm than anyone in New Zealand. But for me, I come from a background in land and outdoor types of research, and the smoke-free environments that had been so effective with smoking and commercial tobacco just didn't seem to be working from anecdotally what we were hearing. So we wanted to explore that further. So what did we do, and who were they? Who did we speak to? We undertook a kind of focus group approach, but it was a Māori way of doing it, in the sense that we, the concept was Māori, in the sense that we knew people in the community. We used snowballing types of techniques for them to find a group of their peers that they would like to talk to about this, about stealth vaping and what its context was. And not everyone was Māori, but the way we were doing it, we were able to ask things about Māori context and Māori worldviews because of the group. And the two locations were in the central North Island and down here in the southern South Island. And the style of conversation, or the style of data, if you wish to, that was collected was pūrākau, so narratives, because exploring them contribute so much richness to what we're hearing and what we can share and transform. And I think what's really important in this discussion, when there is a lot of debate about vaping and whether it is harmful or not. What was really important for us is 9 of our 19 participants across the 7 groups had never smoked, but they had been vaping, and either were currently or had been. And so that's nearly half of them, so the idea, within our group, without even talking to them, we knew that our group were more involved in vaping than they ever had been in smoking. So it continued to reinforce that we were talking to the right people, I guess, about this. Straight into the results. We don't have a long session. So all vaping is stealthy vaping. So the way that vaping was put to us is that they were so portable and so easy to use, and there was nothing offensive about them really, that you could just vape anywhere. And so this first quote about being able to go out of the building, and in the past you'd have to walk to the smoke-free environment or the smoke-free area on the roads outside the buildings. This participant said, no, it's all good. I can just start vaping as soon as I leave the building. And then another key part of it is that the devices are designed to be sneaky. Actually, I've been talking about them as stealthy, but actually sneaky works better. You just get away with it because you can just slide them away. There's no stubbing out of the cigarette. There's no, at the immediate point of use, there's no obvious rubbish, unlike ash and things, I guess, in the past. And then even you can still control the smoke. You can make it small. Participants sort of said, a pen slips into your pocket. You can slip it up your sleeve. And it's so small you can literally take it anywhere. And actually, although this has changed, we did the research a couple of years ago, they're not terribly expensive, so that you can take them out on a night out and not be terribly worried if you have it confiscated at a concert or somewhere. So that was, their voices were really strong about just how easy it was. And then we asked about the Māori world. So what was vaping in a Māori world? Because we knew that we have no history as Māori of tobacco as a sacred product, unlike a sacred plant, unlike our cousins in North America and Turtle Island, or even smoking ceremonies, which is the practices for our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Australia. So we asked them explicitly about vaping in the Māori world, and they were very knowledgeable about the history of tobacco in our communities. That it's been made money off us. This was a sort of string of comments from one of the groups from a variety of people. So that historical knowledge was very well known. They know about the harms and associated with colonisation, associated with the killing of fauna and flora, but also that cheekiness, I guess, or that resistance. But all these things have happened to us, but we're still here, and we were able to still talk to them. But there was that for some, they understood the tikanga, the protocols. That, oh no, you shouldn't be using a vape in a marae, even though it was easy to do. But then another person in another group said, oh, you kind of go around so the adults don't see you, and you just dodge the aunties. But if she's not there, they'll go outside and vape. For this person, not in the wharenui itself, but other people talked about actually knowing people had vaped in the wharenui. And then there was a discussion about what is it to be Māori, and we can see at the congregation of people using various devices it's that opportunity to interact with people, and it's whakawhanaungatanga, a relationship building process that we have embedded in the way in who we are and how we operate. But also this idea of tūpeka kore, which is just eradication of tobacco, and vaping doesn't deserve to be anywhere. It's not part of who we are. It doesn't benefit our people, and it shouldn't be has no reflection on who we are. So kind of in the end, how did we sort of synthesize that? We decided, well, we knew that social justice is important, and that's that tūpeka kore and tobacco end game. So in the end, we have to get rid of tobacco products, certainly. And that empowerment of a smoke-free generation was really important. We spoke to people, young people. They're all mostly between 18 and 24. So they wanted their generation, and they wanted to be listened to, and they said they weren't being listened to. So they wanted that smoke-free generation to be empowered for them. They wanted their voices heard. The addiction came through really strongly. I'm not an expert in that at all, but the relationship of addiction to stealth vaping was talked about a lot. And in the end, the devices were facilitating ease of vaping anywhere. Just what they are. They're not offensive. They're small and easily to slip into any sort of pocket. So that was sort of the results, really, in a nutshell. So how do we conclude this? So we still, in the end, we thought we needed to talk about device regulation, because actually for tobacco control, that the smoking aspect was really useful to reduce smoking prevalence. And so the way that devices are for vaping was facilitating continued use. So, but that's quite a tricky thing, because normally if we think about our tūpeka kore and endgame, we're thinking about more systemic changes. And so focusing on devices and individuals is a little bit counter to that. But I think we need to be thinking in multi ways to solve this. And those device modifications would facilitate the efficacy of smoke-free environments. And then finally go deeper into Māori environments to extend the places where the strengths that comes from being Māori will overcome the need to vape. And so I think that's something that we can strongly work with. So thank you. I've run out of time. Appreciate our participants for their deep thinking and insightful comments. We had a whakatauki that guided us as well, and also reflects on my last point, ka tākohua mai te maunga. So thinking about with the peak of the maunga shrouded in mist, there's always things that we're not going to reach into, and so those are the things that we need to respect and think about other ways of accessing those and using that to support our people. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, ko Simon Hales aho. Hope you can hear me all right and see me. I don't seem to be moving on my screen. Is it working all right, Louise? Yes, good, okay. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a study I did for the World Health Organization, thinking about what the future health impacts of climate change might be in the Western Pacific region, which is basically from New Zealand all the way up to China and most of the things in between. So it's about a third of the world's population. This is just a summary of some of the different pathways by which climate change can affect health. And so climate change at the top. And then in red, I've got extreme events. That includes things like floods and droughts, and they can cause direct injuries and deaths. And one thing that's been studied quite a lot in this category is heat waves, which I will touch on later. So those are relatively direct effects that were reasonably easy for us to get a grip on. But as you can see, it gets a lot more complicated if we consider the effects of climate change on other things, which then in turn affect our health. So, for example, production of food on a global scale will affect malnutrition, disruption of our livelihoods and our ways of life will affect our mental health. And there are many examples where infectious diseases can be influenced in their transmission, for example, through food or water, or through vectors and diseases of animals. So I won't go through all of those, but I'll just give you some examples. And just to give you a bit of context, in general, we're only able to confidently quantify the more direct short-term effects, and many of the indirect ones that I mentioned in the last slide, we can only really partly quantify them or simply in qualitative terms. Generally speaking, it's easier for us to identify and quantify health impacts of climate versus non-climate factors when the climate factor is a really important determinant of the health impact. So let me give you a couple of examples. This diagram is illustrating the effect, the direct effect of heat waves. So you can see the red arrow indicating daily temperature is directly affecting our health because if we're outdoors, we're directly affected by the ambient temperature. That said, it's not necessarily that simple because, of course, if we're in a city with a lot of green space, for example, it might be a lot cooler than a city that's basically asphalt and concrete. And equally, socioeconomic factors, the design of cities and the quality of our housing, ability to afford air conditioning, for example, will also influence the effect of high temperature. And here's an indirect effect. So if supposing that in New Zealand, let's say, I'm actually in Christchurch at the moment, let's say in Canterbury, there is a heavy rainfall event. What is likely to happen is that some of the waste from the livestock will tend to get washed into water systems. And then if people haven't got adequate water and sanitation for their house, then there's an increased risk of zoonoses, of diarrheal illness like Campylobacter or cryptosporosis. So here, the heavy rainfall is not directly affecting our health, but it's going through a sort of a cascade of other natural and human systems. So clearly that tends to make it a more complex thing to try to assess. So WHO asked me to focus on the future impacts of climate change, but we have to start by thinking about the studies of observed patterns of relationships between human health and climate variability. Now, this is quite an active area of research, and my study was completed about 6 months ago, so it's probably already a bit out of date. So the starting point for this work is to find as many studies as possible relating to historical patterns between climate variability and health. And I should note that normally we can't say whether an effect on health is related specifically to climate change as opposed to natural variability. And an example of that would be a study in Asia, which found that over recent years, about 9% of deaths were attributable to temperatures being too cold, the daily temperature being too cold or too hot. And I imagine many of you might think, well, that presumably the hot temperatures are the worst thing here. But actually, what they found was about 2.4 million people per year were dying prematurely because of cold temperatures, but only about 0.2 of a million historically due to hot temperatures. So that's not to say that ratio of cold to heat effects would continue, but that's what they found for the recent past. There's one study which is almost unique in that they were able to attribute the mortality relating to heat waves specifically to climate change. So what they were saying was, if climate change hadn't happened, then these people wouldn't have died. So that's quite a big proportion. that was not representative, unfortunately, of Asia, but it was some selected studies around the world where the sufficient data were available. So how do we assess the future impacts of climate change? Well, we start from the epidemiological studies of the observed relationships, as I described in the last slide, for example. And then we estimate what might happen to future climate. And for this, we typically use global circulation models, or GCMs. These are models of how the climate system reacts to greenhouse gases. And then we take our empirical epidemiological models and we feed in the new climate, the future climate that comes from the GCMs. And typically we assume that there's no change in the underlying relationship. And to do this, we have to rely on scenarios, assumptions about how the future will unfold, both in terms of the climate relating to the emissions of greenhouse gases, and also how socioeconomic trends and sort of underlying issues relating to health might change. So just that's a brief summary of the results that I found. Heat-related mortality was projected to increase, especially in South Asia, but it was offset by reductions in cold-related mortality as there were fewer cold days. Around the middle of the century, approximately, there was a switch over so that there were more heat-related deaths than the cold-related ones. Higher temperatures and also heavy rainfall events and flooding was studied in several countries and would affect the transmission of infectious diseases. So, for example, a study looked at enteric diseases, that's diarrhea, and looked at the effect of temperature. They found that the diarrhea caused by bacteria would increase pretty much everywhere, but the enteric disease caused by viruses has actually had the opposite effect. That was reduced by higher temperatures. So there was a mixed picture there. And also for vector-borne diseases, there was also a mixed picture. I'll give you the example of a study of dengue fever. So this map, I hope you can see from the outline of the countries where we're looking at. The colours represent the number of months of the year over that 30-year period in the past, where the climate was suitable for the dengue fever to be transmitted. So dengue is a viral disease that's transmitted by mosquitoes. It's something that's getting increasingly worse, partly related to how the climate is changing. In any case, here's the pattern based on this study, looking at the past. And then when they fed in the GCM projections of future climate, the changes occurred like this. And I'll just show with some circles where in several places, for example, in Papua New Guinea, in the Pacific Islands, and in Southeast Australia, there were increases in the transmission season. So quite a lot of Australia, for example, had regions where there were all 12 months of the year would become suitable for transmission. But in other places, in northern India, Pakistan, and probably Nepal here, the temperatures are actually getting too high. And so as a result of that, the mosquitoes can't survive and the disease actually decreases. And an even more complex issue is malnutrition. This is because, of course, people's ability to obtain sufficient nutrition is based a lot, not just on their local climate, especially in a country like New Zealand, but it's more based on their socioeconomic status. Nevertheless, in poorer countries, it's estimated that up sort of between 500 and 1 billion children might be affected by severe stunting in the future as a result of climate change, whereas another study was looking at particularly the consumption of fresh fruit and vegetables, and that estimated there might be about 500,000 additional child deaths. And both of those studies were global, but most of the additional deaths found were in the Asia-Pacific region. So to conclude, are these kind of numbers, are they helpful? Do they affect the policies? It's a bit hard to say, certainly not as much as the scientists would like. The policymakers typically want to know what's going to happen soon, as in a few years or in 2030. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, in 2030, climate change doesn't have a very clear signal that we can isolate the health impacts. That doesn't really happen until approximately the mid-century. But of course, if we wait till then to act, then we're probably going to be too late. The other major drawbacks, also limitations of this type of work, is that only a relatively small subset of the likely health impacts can be quantified in this sort of epidemiological approach. There are major gaps in the geographic coverage as well. You need quite detailed data to be able to do these studies. Many countries simply don't have the available data. And these are sort of rather taking each disease in isolation in a reductionist way, which, well, it works, but it's limited in as much as it doesn't take into account how the different impacts might interact with each other, or how things might, one problem might lead to another in a cascading way. Also, we're very much assuming that the climate will change as projected by the global circulation models in a rather sort of predictable linear way, whereas we know that that isn't necessarily going to be the case. And so just to consider for a moment the application of this kind of work to policy, I think it's we can show that if we mitigate climate change, if we reduce the severity of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, particularly methane in New Zealand, then we can show with this type of study that will greatly reduce the severity of these health impacts. However, there are a lot of uncertainties, and the fact that we are using scenarios to project into the future, it makes it quite difficult to explain faithfully what the science is saying without making it seem like we really don't know whether things are going to go one way or another. The implications of this kind of work for specific policies on adapting to climate change is not straightforward, and it's often very locally specific. And equally, climate change, of course, is not the only thing that will change in coming decades. We're not yet really very confident about what's going to happen to other socioeconomic factors, which will be probably equally or perhaps even more important than the climate change trends. So one thing I've been trying to get off the ground for about a decade is a kind of a grand unified model of climate health impacts, ideally a global one, that takes all of these studies and assimilates the data and allows you to extrapolate from the places with a study for those without, and also allows the policymakers to make their own decisions. So that's still an ambition of mine. Thanks very much.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ka nui taku mihi kia koutou, he mihi nui kia koe, Louise, nā hau I whakatuwhera I tō tātou nei hui. He mokopuna hau no te tairāwhiti, no ngā iwi o Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu me Ngai Tūhoe, e mihi ana hau kia koutou. I noho ana hau I nāia nei I o tautahi. So coming to you from Christchurch and from the University of Otago in Christchurch. And I work in the kaupapa of kai, and I have for a long time been really interested in kai and how our people can access healthy kai. So my kaupapa that I'd like to share with you is about local food and sustainable food, and thinking about how our local environments can enable enough people to eat in ways that are both healthy but also sustainable. So kain tu papatua nuku, picking up on some of the things that Simon has just discussed with you all. I think point one, we've always valued a secure food supply. This line is from a mōtiatia that some of you listening may know. It's called pōpō, and it's a mōtiatia, ori about kumara and many other kinds of kai. And it speaks to the knowledge our tipuna had around kai, and this particular is from the Gisborne area, this particular ori, and it's about kumara and how Hakirirangi is acknowledged as bringing kumara to Aotearoa so that people can eat. And that image there is from my colleague Ken of a kumara. But one of the things you may know is that in May 2024, there was a report published by the Public Health Advisory Committee of our government. And the very, very first report that Public Health Advisory Committee did was about rebalancing our food system. And so big mihi to the people on that committee for thinking about this kaupapa, because what that particular report, and it's, a good 100 pages long for those of you who are interested, and I've popped a link there to the report. This report really talked in a lot of detail about the problems of our food system that we currently face. So it acknowledged, and this is just a straight cut and paste from the particular report, that our methods of producing food in Aotearoa, while they are good for the economy, they actually threaten systems of survival that are vital to our well-being. They pollute often the land and the air and the water through their production, and we also import a lot of highly processed foods, which impacts our own knowledges and our own mātauranga about kai. The fact that this really impacts Māori, the pollution of land and fresh water and marine make it difficult, say, for people to go out and gather kai moana. And that actually more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions that we put out in Aotearoa, New Zealand, are directly related to the food system that then again impact our ability to grow kai. I whakapapa to the Tairāwhiti region, and climate change is real in that region with the way we were impacted by Cyclone Hales and Cyclone Gabriel. The report had some recommendations, and there were lots of amazing recommendations, and it would be absolutely brilliant if the government put those particular recommendations into action. I live in hope, but some of there were two ones I want to draw to your attention. The first one was about enabling local communities. So there was the recommendation that the Minister of Health should work with his colleagues in the government to resource and enable community leadership for local food systems. So supporting community participation within local decision making, and supporting our local governments to develop and implement local and regional food strategy. And then there was also a recommendation about iwi and hapu and supporting the growth and revitalisation of Indigenous Māori food systems and things like the protection of mahinga kai. So there were those two recommendations there from that report in 2024. And those are brilliant recommendations, personally, kia haunei, but is there any rangahau to support how you might implement those so that we can have local environments that encourage and enable people to eat healthy kai? And it just so happens I've been on a few research projects that have really grappled with some of those, how we might do that. So this is a little kohinga kōrero of some of the things I've learned in the last few years from some of the research projects I've been on. One of the projects was called Sustainable New Zealand Kai, which I worked on with these wonderful people here, many of the lecturers from our departments of public health here at Otago, but also some other people. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Christina there, who was the leader of this particular project. I've also worked on another project called the Cancer Society Research Collaboration, because, of course, eating healthy kai is one of the things we can do to prevent some of the risk factors for some cancers. And I've worked on that collaboration with people like Louise and also Robin. And there's a new project that I'm beginning to work on, which I've learnt quite a lot, especially about with my own iwi. And this is a project called Exploring the Mental Health Impacts of Climate Change on Kai Sovereignty. And this is a photo of us out in the field in action. And the guy there in glasses is my other co-PI on the project, Dr. Ken Taiapa. And that's our research team out at Amara at the back of Te Awera Marae, which is in Ruatoria in the Tairāwhiti. Hoi anō. One of the things that I have learnt is that when you talk to people about sustainability, there's actually quite different opinions. People will tell you slightly different things about sustainability. So I think defining what you mean is always quite important. This was one of the particular definitions that people told us when I was working with Christina. I guess to me, a sustainable diet is one that's, how the food is produced, how it's manufactured, is it appropriate for different cultures, and is it eating locally and seasonally? So that's quite a common definition. But also, we talked with Māori people in that particular project, and we noticed that some of the definitions were also saying that sustainability meant kai that's produced of what our nannies feed us, and that we're actually able to produce that kai for our own mokopuna. And in that particular picture, they've got kutai there, mussels. So are we still able to access our kaimoana? And are we still able to access our tuna, our eels? I was at a kōrero in the school holidays, and I spent a good day learning all the different words associated with eeling for the people down here in Ōtautahi. And then another thing, this is another kōrero that was coming through, is sustainability is about the kōrero tuku iho that connects us with the environment. And so the ngahere and the moana and the stories that are with the environment, and the ability to share those stories and that mātauranga and that tupuna practice. And that was another kōrero coming through when we talk about sustainability. And actually just on that, even kai, people, when you talk about kai, are you just talking about food that is available from a supermarket, or are you talking about food that is available from the environment and your pātaka kai and your mahinga kai and things like that? So there's slightly different kōrero coming through when you talk with different communities about kai and sustainability. The people who control the environment in a particular area are your local councils or your regional councils or your district councils. And I know we've just had the voting about the local government. And so I actually got really, really interested with Louise, and we were on a project that we learnt a lot about local governments, and we were interested in local governments and local councils because of their ability to control at a local level some of the factors that enable people to access kai. And so I did some work with Louise and also Rana really to try and support local councils to create healthy food environments for people. And we developed some tools, and so that we could do workshops with local councils and almost kind of measure and give ideas about, oh, these are some of the things you could be doing to ensure the people in your area are able to access healthy kai. So we developed this tool called the food, and we were also interested in alcohol, but I'm not going to talk about that, the food and alcohol epi tool. And this is a link to the website where we've actually popped the tool, Environmental Policy Initiative epi tools, and I'll just show you an example of the tool. So you can sit down with a particular local council and you can ask them, are you showing leadership, high level support and leadership in relation to healthy and environmentally sustainable food environment? Are you showing leadership? Do you have a strategy? Do you have a policy? Are you working with iwi in relation to that policy? And so we've just, we did a good, one of the members of our research team spent a long time looking at all the different council websites, trying to find out about the different policies. And we also talked to a lot of the people working in councils around a lot of the things that they were doing. So this is just one of the many things that we covered in that particular tool, if you're interested. And so these are some of the examples of some of the things that councils are doing. We found out, for example, that the Wellington, all the different councils within the Wellington region are getting together, and they've got something called a regional kai network, and a regional kai map and that kind of thing. So I think sometimes when central government is not all that responsive, looking to local government and looking at what they are doing and the kind of actions they're enabling are quite important. And then another thing is, this is again flicking back to the research project I did with Christina Cleghorn. Christina Cleghorn is really, really good at modelling. And we said to people, if you could pick any particular policy that you'd like to see happen so that there could be, people could have access to healthy, sustainable kai, what might that be? And so we picked about 6 different policies that Christina then modelled. She modelled, for example, and I don't have the slide, but she modelled what would happen if you reduce the GST of healthy food, or you had a slightly lower price for healthy food, and what might then be the impacts. But that's a policy at a national level. In terms of policies at local levels, what would happen if you had a policy that actually provided funding to community champions to support the setup and the maintenance of mara kai? And because we talked to people and they said, mate, there's so much funding for projects, but sometimes you need to fund people. You need to fund the movers and the shakers that are, usually the ones that are the gardeners, and they'll be the ones that'll keep the kaupapa going. I walked into a marae once and you could tell who the gardener was because they had some kumara tipu sprouting on their desk. So people told us you need to fund those people in order to get your mara kai going. And Christina did some really fancy modelling, which I do not fully understand, but I will put links to this if you're interested. But if you actually did this, if you funded community champions on marae to have mara, then that would, one, impact haura, and it would also help health equity. Because it's a way of getting at a community level vegetables and hua whenua, hua mara in front of people. And again, we also looked at kura because schools are really important within our community. And what would happen if you funded coordinators to support kura to have kai as well? And again, that that was a policy that was important for people's haura and important for health equity. So that's just some of the work that Christina has done. And really, hei whakarāpoto, to finish up, one of the things that I've thought about lately in my work and with Kai is, I think I was really interested in policies that the national government could do. And I still am. And in the report I referenced at the beginning, there are lots of policies that I think our government, if it cares about this particular issue, should really do. But I have found in talking with people that people are amazing. And we have so many champions out there who are just getting out and planting and looking after their mara and looking after their mahinga kai. And this particular quote here from one of our research participants, I just love it, and I'm going to go out after this and go into my mara. So it's an act of rangatiratanga, and it's an act you can undertake on a daily basis. That pretty much sometimes the whole decolonial project feels so huge and so whole overwhelming, but we can go out and we can plant, and that is what gardening meant for that particular person. A bit like the words of our Queenie Māori, kia kōrero i tō tātou nei reo, kia tiaki hoki i tō tātou nei taiao. And those are just a big mihi to all the people that I've worked with and all the wonderful illustrators. And that is just some other references and resources that might be useful for your kite mātauranga.